The story of the motorcycle jacket is not just one of machines and war and coded masculinity, which does feature in this story, but it is really the story of how, at its most powerful, fashion is a vehicle for counterculture, and how the disaffected and disenfranchised can sometimes share things in common that actually manifest sartorially of all ways. Like the motorbike itself, the leather jacket has a non-linear history that has spread into many tangents since it first appeared in the early 20th century. So today I'm going to be talking about just a couple of those overlapping and parallel histories of the jacket, because to talk about it in full, I might be here for a week. So we're going to keep it fresh and tight. I'm going to begin by talking about the material history of the motorbike jacket, where it emerged, its predecessors, who wore it first and why, because the historical context from which the jacket emerges is really important to its trajectory as a cultural symbol. We're then going to look at the multiplicity of the leather jacket as a symbol within subcultural style. We're going to look at how the meaning of the jacket has been appropriated and reimagined in different ways, particularly during the mid-20th and late 20th century. Many of these ways which are exciting, edgy, and sometimes titillating. We're then going to explore what high fashion specifically has done with the jacket, how it took such a strong symbol and managed to not only commodify it, but also challenge the seemingly rigid ideas of gender associated with the jacket through its repurposing. Finally, I'm going to end with a bit of a reflection of why. Why are we so obsessed with the leather jacket? Why has it always been cool? And I kind of mean this beyond its association with motorbikes. I'm going to do a little bit of analysis for you about the jacket in terms of, I guess, what I propose and think from a fashion analysis point of view, why it has remained a symbol of cool consistently since its invention in the early 1900s. Pretty much like no other fashion garment has. There's not many that parallel the staying power of the leather jacket. So before I start, I'm just going to take this jacket off. Like, that was a great time. I'm sure everybody enjoyed that themed entry, but it's still summer in Brisbane. So we're back to summer wear. We're going to start by going back, and I mean way back. The use of leather or animal hides generally stretches back to early hunter-gatherer times, where animals were both a source of food and clothing. Leather is formed when animal skins undergo the process of tanning, making the material supple, strong, and more water resistant and less decomposable. Traditionally, antelope skin, buck skin, lamb skin, sheep skin. Lamb skin is the jacket that I'm wearing right now, and cowhide are the most commonly used to make leather jackets. For motorcycle jackets, horsehide was the leather of choice up until about the 1960s, when steer hide was introduced, and followed by that naked cowhide in the late 1970s. Some critics argue that the quality of cowhide leather jackets has deteriorated over time, and thus horsehide these days is kind of viewed as like a special order, high quality item. In the early 1900s, as we can see here, aviators and members of the American and sometimes European military wore brown leather flight jackets. One of the first modern leather jackets, the Type A1, was created by Chappell in 1925. And here in this image, we see a close relative, the A2 jacket worn by the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, heavy-duty leather flight jackets had wraparound collars, they had wind flaps, snug cuffs and waistbands, and we saw these used in World War I when pilots needed exceptionally thick and durable outerwear while flying at rapid speeds and at high altitude in open cockpits, as the planes had open cockpits still in World War I. Those early flight jackets made of a brown capeskin leather piece became known as the bomber jacket style. Now, the bomber jacket traditionally is waist length. It had lower front button flat pockets, and it had kind of snug worsted wool on the cuffs, collar, and waistbands. Rather than a zipper on the center, though, the jacket used buttons, as this was more standard at the time. So following this use in the early 20th century, I'm just going to open my chat quickly. There we go. Following this use in the early 20th century in the military, the leather jacket in men's fashion began its transition into the mainstream in the late 1920s, in that period between World War I and World War II. This was partly due, or we might say mostly due, to two brothers who helped transform the leather jacket from uniform item into something that could be worn by the average person. Here we see the Scott Perfecto jacket. Now, this is not an image of the original, but it's a high quality modern image of an essentially identical jacket design. I'm going to quickly give you the history of this before I undo this jacket a bit itself. So Irving and Jack Scott were two Russian Jewish immigrants who and brothers who opened a store in New York's Lower East Side in 1913. The brothers originally made rubber raincoats, which were sold by door-to-door peddlers. These brothers were always interested in the army surplus items that came out of war efforts. And from this, the brothers secured a contract for making jackets for the US military during World War I. This greatly expanded their business. Additionally, Irving Scott, one of the brothers, was fascinated by motorcycles. He began producing jackets for bikers that were distributed by one of the earliest motorcycle promoters, the Beck Company. These early jackets were buttoned, much like the ones we saw in the military images previously. But in 1928, one of the brothers, Irving Scott, met with a representative from Beck, the motorcycle distribution company, and a representative from Talon, the major zipper manufacturer at the time, at a clothing conference. This is where Irving was inspired, and from this he designed the first ever jacket that included a zipper. He called it the Perfecto, after his favorite cigar, rather than Scott, their last name, because he didn't think their Jewish last name would sell the coat at this period in time. This adaptation of early aviation jackets with zips instead of buttons made the jacket much more appropriate to sell in the broader market compared to the cumbersome buttons of previous ones. The new Perfecto style jacket had a Lancer front to cut wind chill, fullness through the shoulders to allow for a fuller range of arm movement when steering a bike, and a waisted cut for comfort when riding seated. This style has remained popular and almost unchanged, with some slight adaptations up until current day. And I just saw someone in the chat say they've got this jacket. Yes, this jacket is still produced in kind of the modern iterations of it, but largely it is identical to the one first sold in 1928. Interestingly, the early aviator jackets that we saw in the Tuskegee Airmen have also remained popular in style, but have been called the bomber jacket. As you might know of any bombers you've encountered, you might know that generally these days bombers are produced in synthetics or water-resistant fabrics. As technology advanced, this change happened. And this style, the bomber, has its own unique lineage, which I won't have time to touch on today, but I am going to touch back on later because it has an interesting subcultural moment worth mentioning here. So by the 1960s, Harley-Davidson, Beck, and a host of other clothiers, including Seals and Montgomery Ward, were selling these motorcycle jackets to the mass public. This was boosted by, a growing community of motorcycle enthusiasts, motorcycle events, and organizations from the 1930s onwards. During this time, the motorbike jacket continued to be marketed to and sold throughout Middle America. As we can see here in some of these early 1950s Harley-Davidson ads, the jackets were marketed as kind of, functional and stylish sportwear attire for the motorbike enthusiasts, and generally were produced for both men and women. Parallel to the growing world of motorcycle enthusiasts, perhaps catered to by these advertisements, was an explosion of motorcycle gangs directly tied to the aftermath of World War II. Motorcycle clubs emerged mostly in Southern California, but also across the rest of the US and in other countries as well during the 1940s. The kind of growth, the establishment and growth of motorcycle clubs reflected a disaffection with the mainstream culture post-World War II in America. And whilst they remained mostly an underground culture until about 1947, an event happened in 1947 on the July 4th weekend, which was later made famous by a film we're about to talk about in a moment. On this weekend in particular, a gang of about 4,000 bikers strong rode into Hollister, California. This gang was known as the Booze Fighters, and it ended up in a fairly tumultuous interaction with the California State Troopers who restored order. Famously, this clash was then publicized by Life magazine in an article about the events, which essentially demonized all the bikers in that moment. From this article, which had quite a fair reach at this point in American cultural, popular imagination, a new monster was created for the American public. In addition to this kind of, new villain framed by the Life article also was this new style of masculinity, typified by bikers, the association with motorbikes themselves, and adorned in these, striking motorbike jackets, which really became a new version of masculinity at this time. The most important moment in this history, arguably, of the black leather jacket was the release of the film The Wild One in 1953. starring Marlon Brando as Johnny Strabler. The Wild One was loosely based on the Hollister riot, and interestingly, apparently some of the original gang members were actually involved in the production. Irving and Jack Scott, designers of the Perfecto, provided all of the motorcycle jackets for the movie, which we can see the cast wearing here. Brando famously wore the new W Star, One Star, which became an instant bestseller for Scott. Brando's character also created a new kind of persona for the American men to look up to. It was the outsider and the anti-hero, born from this film. The pop cultural fascination with the Hollister riot, as glorified in the Wild One film, kind of ran deep and widespread throughout America. And it really promoted an image of masculine independence that really resonated with some men who were dissatisfied with mainstream culture. From juvenile delinquents to bikers to leathermen and punk, who we will talk about later, punks, the darker, more dangerous, more volatile, hyper-masculine male found a common model to model themselves after, swathed in black motorcycle leather. The jacket, in a sense, became literally another skill that protects the rider, and it became a metaphorical second skin that the vulnerable anti-hero wears for protection. From this point onwards, the jacket began to take on different meanings in different subcultural groups. So moving on from the Wild One, I'm now going to look at some of the ramifications of this new masculine anti-hero identity and therefore, I guess, symbolism had in terms of affecting broader subcultures that emerged in that mid-20th century period. The motorbike and the motorbike jacket became a symbol of rebelliousness, with an anti-establishment ethos and also generally of cool, particularly the jacket itself. As we said, Brando's anti-hero character was extremely popular with young American men, and the jacket became this really, embodied idea of rebellion, really symbolic of rebellion. So much so that the jackets were actually banned in high schools across the country in 1955, which only increased their power in a law. This is some of the kind of early twinklings of the punk identity, this kind of anti-establishment ethos. In the latter half of the 20th century, the leather jacket in many forms continued to, bolster its iconic status and general acceptance through its link to Hollywood. And now, while in this lecture, I won't be going over extensively over this link with Hollywood, I do want to mention it briefly here. Of course, we know we had Marlon Brando in the Wild One, but he also had icons like James Dean, Elvis Presley. I'm sure you can name many more. Due to this kind of group of people's popularization of leather jackets in American youth, one of the subcultures that shot off from that was the greaser subculture of the early 50s and 60s. If we move forward a little bit in time, we think about other icons of this leather jacket, including the Fonz in Happy Days in the 70s and 80s. Moving forward even further, the T-800 character in the Terminator films wears actually a Scott Perfecto jacket. And again, like I said, there's so many people you can think of, but another, notable one that comes to mind is the Brad Pitt's character in Fight Club. The list of pop culture references for the leather jacket is endless. And as I said, I'm not going to dare to cover them today. But I bring this point up because it's really important to note that pretty much any significant popular cultural appearance of the leather jacket drew its symbology either from the original association with outlaws and the anti-hero of the biker gang, or further subcultural uses of the jacket, which we see emerge in the second half of this 20th century. So in that line of thinking, we're going to look at the subcultures now. I'm going to flash forward now to 1970s New York. In 1970s New York, motorcycle jackets were practically a mandatory uniform, particularly for noticeable bands and the clientele of clubs that they played in. As we can see here, bands like the Ramones, musicians like Blondie and Joan Jett, and over the pond, the Sex Pistols, wore the style continuously as it continued to carry a sense of countercultural, attitude-heavy rebellion, and, set them really clearly apart from more conservative fashion norms at the time. American music journalist Legs McNeil argues that the Ramones were the originators of the leather jacket in the punk scene, and they themselves were directly inspired by Brando's character in The Wild One. On the other side of the pond, actually quickly, I'll show you an image of the wonderful Joan Jett and Debbie Harry from Blondie in leather jacket, just to reiterate with you that whilst there are a lot of image of masculine presenting people in this lecture with jackets on, feminine presenting people also wear jackets. Hot tip. Now, across the pond at the same time, the Sex Pistols emerged as the kind of, Brit version of punk, who emerged in London in 1975. As we know, they, have been credited as having a really significant influence on the punk image. And, they've got this really strong association of anarchism within the music scene and within music history. The Sex Pistols were famously managed by Malcolm McLaren, partner of Vivienne Westwood, and were often dressed in punk fashions from McLaren and Westwood's shop called Sex. Now, as I've kind of touched on, these bands, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, were part of a broader global subculture that had kind of specific local chapters called punk. The punk and you might have heard of it, I don't know, maybe once or twice. The punk subculture includes different ideologies, fashion, and other forms of creative expression like music, art, dance, literature, and film. At its core, punk is characterized by anti-establishment views, the promotion of individual freedom, DIY aesthetics, and it's centered around, aggressive anarchist music. The punk ethos is primarily made up of beliefs such as nonconformity, anti-authoritarianism, anti-corporatization, and anti-corporate greed, and not selling out, just in case you're wondering. One of the reasons that punk was so well placed to, I guess, be a courier for the leather jacket and to kind of really use the symbology of the black leather jacket so, well, I guess, to get across their anti-establishment point of view, was partly in reason to the timing of punk. Post-World War II, so we're talking kind of the decades after the war is over, the leather jacket became very widely available because there were obviously certain kinds of leather jackets used in all variations in warfare, some of which were those early aviation jackets we saw and bomber styles, but essentially a really broad number of them were used as general uniform as well. And following World War II, there was a huge surplus supply of them that, if they were discarded by military forces, were essentially sent into the thrift system, meaning that young people had great access to them. Outside of those kind of younger thrifting, which is a thing that kind of began then, was also people who were, ex-servicemen and essentially were wearing these jackets in their everyday life. In that way, the leather jacket was kind of adopted en masse by disenfranchised youth, mostly working class, in the decades that followed the World War II. So in that sense, we can kind of see how this leather jacket was so perfectly primed to enter into the sartorial vocabulary of punk, a group that is, so used to picking and mixing styles, and also is often full of disaffected youth, who might engage in practices like op shopping. One thing that I guess punks are really well known at, and here's some beautiful images of little later punks, early 1980s punks in London, from fashion theorist Ted Polmus. As Polmus explains, punks are known for a practice called bricolage, the idea of the combination of disparate sartorial elements to forge new meaning or eradicate any meaning at all. As Polmus explains, stylistically, the punk objective was to mix together the diverse, the unexpected, the absurd, and sometimes the completely contradictory combinations of style. They would scavenge things like cultural designs from world dress, subversive fetish wear. They'd scavenge from other style tribes like bikers, skinheads, glam rockers, teddy boys. They would, appropriate 50s kitsch, 40s glamour, tacky sci-fi films, and military uniforms, and the list goes on. The punk aesthetic was a rich bag of alternatives and contradictions that sartorially protested against the rules of respectability and the codes of societal structures. I want to quickly mention here, apart from, the punk's use of the leather jacket as this kind of wonderfully rich anti-establishment symbol, and you can see how incredibly well these guys DIY their leather jackets. It's worth mentioning here the role, I guess, the skinheads within the history that we're talking about right now. I haven't included images of them because they are wearing bomber jackets and they are distinctly different from biker jackets, so I just don't want to make that crossover. But I guess why I want to mention them is because they're a good segue into the next subculture I want to talk about. The skinheads were really interesting because the kind of, in the late 60s, the original British skinheads were some of the first to adopt the jacket as a really clear sartorial expression of the changing conditions of the time, the changing social conditions. And remember, this is, in the decades right after the end of World War I is when this is really happening and being adopted by youth. by the kind of late 1970s, whilst skinheads started with, many skinheads actually started with quite multicultural origins. By the late 1970s, people involved in the skinhead culture had kind of become more and more involved in far right and racist politics that they're a bit more synonymous with now. What's so interesting about that is that not long after skinheads, became so fortified as this quite, I guess, racist subculture, it's really ironically seen that actually the gay community in London was one of the first to re-assimilate the skinhead uniform. And that's really interesting, but it also kind of makes sense in terms of the history of LGBTQ plus resilience and their propensity throughout history to reappropriate that which has aimed to oppress them, thinking most notably about labels and derogatory slang, but also fashion and more abstract ideals like hypermasculinity. So, young gay people dressing in the skinhead in uniform was actually an ultimate subversion of the skinhead values and mentality. So moving on to a very different subculture in a really different vein from punks and skinheads, another notable political movement of the mid-20th century that adopted the leather jacket was the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers altered this style slightly. They wore more a peacoat style of leather jacket with a sleeker finish. The Black Panthers essentially fortified in the late 1960s in Oakland, California, was kind of the hub of this movement. They were extremely aesthetically consistent, and their uniform consisted of a black leather jacket, a powder blue shirt, black pants, black shoes, a black beret, and sometimes black gloves. Sometimes members of the movement would also wear dark glasses as well. And often if they were wearing kind of a lighter version of the uniform, it might just be the glasses and the jacket itself. What's really interesting about the Black Panther movement is that this uniform was really consistently adopted across people involved in the movement. And very few of them strayed away from this core identity, even if they were to kind of add their own personal embellishments to it. Organisers felt that the uniform was a really strong symbol of militancy, and such militancy was essentially what they wished to convey as the Black Panther Party. The use of paramilitary action and sometimes violence to attain their political goals was something that essentially set them apart from, other non-violent civil rights movements counterparts. In the Black Panthers specifically, we see how the use of the leather jacket and other sartorial references to military creates this kind of crisp, militant-like uniform that is hyper-consistent and overall creates a visual force of power. This is really, really opposite to punks. If you think about the way we're using the black leather jacket here, the Black Panthers strategically use the jackets to reference both military beginnings and associations of power and rebelliousness, to consistently convey a message of strength and political agility. On the other hand, punks stood for anarchy and used the jacket to essentially inspire moral panic, where the Black Panthers stood, for human rights and used the jacket to inspire power, a united front, and to take a clear and pointed stance against the status quo. Punks kind of just didn't like anything. So moving on, I now want to talk about, what I think is one of the most significant subcultures who, again, away from punks, away from the Black Panther movement, use the black leather jacket in a really incredible way, I think. It particularly aligns to my interest, and that is leatherware culture. So leatherware culture emerged in the late 1940s when it likely grew out of post-World War II biker culture. Just to kind of quickly define what I mean by leatherware culture, sometimes black leather clothing can be adopted as erotic fashion that can express heightened masculinity or the appropriation of sexual power. Sometimes a love of motorcycles, motorcycle clubs, and independence is incorporated into the use of black leatherware, and or engagement in sexual kink or leather fetishism. Now, just to be clear, and a lot of academic writing, really promotes this idea that just because someone is engaged in leatherware doesn't necessarily mean they're engaged with kink, and just because someone's engaged with kink doesn't necessarily mean they're engaged with leatherware. Sometimes they overlap in a happy Venn diagram, but it's worth keeping that in mind. What's really interesting, about how the leatherware community emerged is that it really emerges, very much right at that key beginning where, you know, motorcycle gangs emerge. They're kind of one and the same. They're just two very different tangents that emerge. Sociologist Meredith Warthen writes that the leather community first emerged after the Second World War, when military servicemen had difficulty assimilating back into mainstream society. For many of these men, their military service had been the first place that they'd been allowed to explore their queer desires. When the war ended, a void was left by the absence of not only, I guess, queer intimacy, but also same-sex friendships that really got them through their experience as, you know, serving in a war. Instead, many found sanctuary in motorcycle communities where leather was popular clothing. The men who rode these bikes were icons of cultural masculinity, as we know, as exemplified by Brandon Marlowe in The Wild One. And they would often conjure up an image of dangerous rebelliousness. And that was really alluring to many gay men at that time, who were really overseeing themselves depicted as one stereotype, which is that of the effeminate gay man. Some masculine presenting men in the gay community started adopting Brando's style quite literally. They would wear the black leather jackets, a black leather cap, black leather boots and jeans. And if they could afford it, they might also be riding a motorcycle. What I really love about the emergence of leatherware culture is that at some point the motorcycle kind of becomes just, you know, like a good accessory or not. It ends up not being really the focus, which is super interesting. The leather wear and the leather jacket becomes of its own, you know, its own cultural status, which is really important at this time. As fashion historian Sean Cole explains, the appeal of the leather look was often that it was at the opposite end of the gendered dress spectrum. It represented a huge step away from the effeminate stereotypes of the past. As well, the leather community that emerged from the motorcycle clubs also, I guess, became a place, both practical and symbolic, for men's open exploration of kink. The first kind of gay leather bar that opened in the United States was the Gold Coast, which opened in Chicago in 1958, which here is an image of later in the century outside that bar. And, you know, these bars opened up around the country and eventually across the world. I think there were some in Sydney, Australia from about the 70s onwards. Ultimately, San Francisco became one of the hubs of the leather subculture. In 1961, when a bar called the Toolbox opened its doors in the neighborhood. Over time, this hub would become, you know, a hub for broader queer culture in the United States. A key player in the growth and popularity of leatherware, someone I absolutely could not, you know, I had to mention in this lecture, is the illustrator Toma Finland. I'm hoping I've got the right slide there. Yes, okay. So in the post-war period, Finnish artist named Tuukka Laaksonen, or Toma Finland, as we became to know, began presenting a new image of gay men in his drawings. These men were jovial, rambunctious, and hyper-masculine in appearance. As fashion theorist Sean Cole explains, Toma Finland had been drawing homoerotic visions of men in uniforms since the 40s. His entire style changed, however, following his viewing of The Wild One. Bikers in black leather began to appear regularly in his works. And theorist Edward Lucy Smith sums up Brando's effect on Toma Finland. The film The Wild One glamorized outlaw biker culture. Biker clothing, most particularly leather jackets, like the one Brando wore in the film, were added to the long list of fetish items that Tom featured in his drawings. Brando himself had an appeal that functioned at least as powerfully with men as it did with women. His sexuality on screen, and as later transpired in real life, was powerfully and seductively ambiguous. In this way, Toma Finland kind of altered the way gay men, I guess, thought about themselves at the time, or he partly contributed to that effect. He also changed the way in which non-gay people thought about the stereotypes of the gay man. As Camille Paglia says, in masculizing the gay persona, Toma Finland broke with the cultural legacy of Oscar Wilde, who promoted and flamboyantly embodied the androgynous aesthetes. As Stephen Steins explains, his illustrations represented the groundbreaking idea that gay men were strong, masculine, and happy. So in this way, we kind of know that the leather jacket began as a typically masculine symbol associated with war and the emergence of the motorcycle itself. And we then see it adopted by a variety of subcultures to challenge authority and notions of good taste. We talked about that with punk and about the Black Panther movement. But here we see the leatherware community use the leather jacket to challenge notions of gender by challenging stereotypes of gay men at the time. Whilst they're still playing on the rigid coded masculinity of the jacket, they did it, in a very non-heteronormative or queer way. Some other really beautiful images I have here just to show you quickly. This is a lovely photo by Robert Mapplethorpe, who was very deeply invested also in that kind of 1970s New York scene. You may know of him as kind of the creative partner of Patti Smith. He is charged with creating some of the first, widely, I guess, circulated images of leatherware culture. And his body of work around this is actually quite beautiful. There's a really great documentary on Netflix about Mapplethorpe at the moment, if you're interested in that. This is an image of Robert Mapplethorpe himself donning his very own black leather jacket and looking menacing, I think, maybe. I'm not really sure, but a great body of work worth looking at. Now, we have gone through a lot of subcultures, and I know we're getting on in time. So the next thing we're going to, sorry. Okay, I just have to put Glenn Hughes in this PowerPoint, because Glenn Hughes from the Village People is just beautiful, and that moustache deserves its own slide. So we will end the leatherware with this image. Moving on from subcultures, we've talked about a few different ways in which the leather jacket was, strategically used to challenge ideas of society. I'm now going to move on to what happened when the biker jacket was incorporated into high fashion. This is what we might call another parallel history of the leather jacket, as it actually happens around the same time as a lot of these other histories are happening as well. So this image is a really interesting start to the incorporation of leather jackets into high fashion. In 1960, a 24-year-old Yves Saint Laurent, then the head designer of Dior, presented his own take on the style of the leather jacket as part of a beatnik-inspired runway collection. Here we see a single-breasted, fur-lined, alligator-imprinted leather women's jacket with cropped sleeves. But interestingly enough, this collection was super, super hated by everybody. It's really interesting because, whilst it was actually, I guess, not appreciated at all by the fashion scene, it went down as history, I guess, from fashion critics or later fashion theorists as a really important moment, because it represented the first time that a fashion designer had been openly inspired by youth culture, keeping in mind what fashion was like at this point, even from, an Australian perspective. For most of the 20th century, certainly up until the 50s and, the post-war period, the giants of fashion, the magazine editors, the designers were telling us, the consuming public, what was fashionable. At this point, we see a turn and subcultures start emerging who don't really care at all about fashion trends. They're making their own styles. Just like the punks, they're making these rich visual sartorial languages which set the pace for fashion. In 1960, this reference to a youth subculture, and when, we might not know exactly which one he was referencing here because many use the leather jacket, but this reference of a youth culture directly seen in a designer's collection was really unheard of. It was really significant. And what's really interesting too is that it was a real precursor to the rest of the 1960s, which was entirely youth obsessed. You might be familiar with the term youthquake. In no industry was that felt more than fashion, and YSL was absolutely onto it with this jacket before that seismic upheaval happens. What's really interesting, like I said, no one liked this collection. Dior specifically really didn't like this collection. So much so that when Yves Saint Laurent got drafted up in the war, the company he worked for, Dior, did not help him get his service kind of cancelled. So he was forced into military service just after making this jacket, and, fired from the house of Dior. Interestingly, though, he only lasted a little while in the military due to a health concern, and he quickly returned to open the house of Yves Saint Laurent, which continues today. So who's the joke on there, Dior? Anyway, moving on, what I really like about that jacket, of course, is the use of, we see the kind of first moments of subcultural style affecting high fashion, which is a really important characteristic of high fashion that would come. Here's another beautiful image that I think embodies this really well as well. This is a Catherine Hamnet design, a UK designer from the 80s. And we can see here clearly she's got some very clear links to punk cultural style as well, specifically the studying practices. But we can kind of see too here, this is a chicer, neater, and certainly cleaner version of what punks wore. But in other ways, it's essentially representing the punk aesthetic as fashion. It's kind of appropriating it into this commodified version. So alongside these subcultural appropriations of the leather jacket, another thing that was happening at the end of the 20th century with the leather jacket is essentially it just became really popular and really prominent in people's popular imagination as the cool uniform of the fashion elite. Since the 1990s, the kind of model off-duty outerwear of choice has long been the biker jacket. This tradition really kicked off, I say, essentially with the supermodels of the 80s and 90s, especially the heyday icons such as Kate Moss, Naomi Campbell, Christine Turlington. All of them kind of did this James Dean throwback to a leather jacket in their model off-duty moments. Here we can see this beautiful image of a very young Kate Moss and Johnny Depp. And on the right, we see Cindy Crawford, again, wearing this essentially what is a leather jacket, a biker jacket, but you can see they're quite soft, deconstructed fashion versions of the jacket. And in this way, the idea of the jacket being very, very cool was really solidified with this, popular use of icons, the supermodels, who at that time were kind of the height of femininity. They were kind of really the height of beauty in the 80s and 90s, and to an extent continue that reputation today. Moving forward a little bit, if we move forward, I guess, to more contemporary iterations of the biker jacket in high fashion, the 90s and 2000s designers kind of continue adapting the motorcycle jacket in fashion. Rick Owens is a really prominent name in this history for his capacity to reimagine the leather jacket into a really classic statement cool piece that would come to dominate fashion, especially in the 2000s. Here we can see Kate Moss on the cover of French Vogue in the early 2000s, shot by Corinne Day, the late Corinne Day. This image was really significant because it caught the attention of Vogue editor Anna Wintour, who organised and to sponsor Rick Owens' next collection, essentially. So kind of made his career from this image. Owens' really avant-garde leather jackets were somewhat inspired by the original Scott Perfecto, but they were, decidedly unique. They kind of remain some of the more enduring and sought-after creations because of their really interesting detailing. What we kind of see in jackets like these is a designer like Owens breaking down and playing with the codes of not only the structure, the designs, and the aesthetics, but also of the historically masculine object that is the leather jacket. He does this in ways of, using this extremely softened and natural looking leather, kind of blurring the boundaries and structure of that shape. And it certainly strips some of the very hard masculine edge that we see in that rigid Scott Perfecto jacket earlier in this lecture. Interestingly enough, the way that fashion adopts the leather jacket, originally through subcultural appropriation, but then also through this reimagining, is that one of the things it does is kind of strip the jacket of its really pragmatic justification. So it's no longer really about utility and protection. It's really about molding to the body and that aesthetic of what that richly tanned and structured or softly structured leather how it looks against kind of soft human flesh. It's a very aesthetic drive to use this jacket in collections. It's also really increasingly used to play on ideas of gender. I think this is a wonderful image expressing that, where we see Agnes Dean, kind of it models of the 2000s. Agnes is wearing this one very typically heteronormatively feminine skirt, tulle, see-through white, tick, 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 matched with a kind of heavily studded black leather jacket and a leather, corset brassiere type garment. This is really interesting and typical of what we come to see actually in how leather jackets are used. Often they are used in fashion from a styling point of view to symbolize a play on gender. I find that really interesting because, this idea of adding this beautifully soft, carefully made, softly structured jacket as a symbol of masculinity in outfit is a very interesting take on it. We will often see outfit styled in magazines that are called Get the Androgynous Look, and they've put a leather jacket over a dress. What I think is more interesting about the use of leather jacket as we go on is how it starts to really erode that idea of, well, how is this a masculine aesthetic? And then it kind of makes you question, how do we even describe clothes as masculine or feminine anymore when we get to things like this? So another image I think is really lovely. is this great image of Elizabeth Moss from the Cannes red carpet. It's kind of a pushed further look of the Agnes Dean look. And it's really interesting because, again, I can't imagine a more feminine adornment than this beautiful chic cropped leather jacket. I think, that if anything we can take away from what high fashion has done to the leather jacket, besides, appropriating it from subcultures, is this wild capacity to really undo those hard heteronormative masculine ideals attached to the jacket. This is a long way from that. The other thing it does, and this is my last image of a jacket before we move on to some concluding statements, is that it has turned the jacket into an extreme luxury item. Now, jackets have always been valued for their excellent quality, their fine materials, their craftsmanship. They often have that kind of pragmatic, masculine discourse around them, around this kind of very special item needed for protection. But then we get here, oh no, wait, I'll show you the next slide. I'll talk about this first. Okay, this is just one final comment about the extreme blurring of codes of masculinity through contemporary fashionable use of the leather jacket. This is a more contemporary runway show of Rick Owens. And here, whatever masculine associations may have traditionally been used in fashion with leather jacket, we are far departing from that and using entirely new gender expressions featuring the black leather jacket. What I was going to say is where we ended up was here. I absolutely love, as all of my students know at ColArts, I always make a lecture come back to Gucci in one way or another, and I'm very glad to have done that tonight. This is a beautiful Gucci jacket from, I think, 2016. And of course, it has the measly price tag of $13,000. So I think what this is a beautiful example of is, using those key kind of thoughts and discourse around the jacket as this quality, valuable item, transferring that into a high fashion haute couture level of detail and craftsmanship, and also commodification. And here at the other end, and also, deeply mixing codes of gender in a garment like this, here at the other hand, we have the black leather jacket as the ultimate luxury item. So it's really changed. I think what's interesting about that is that, jackets have always been valuable, but the kind of valuable has really changed from when they first emerged in 1928 to what they are now in 2020. Kind of, almost couldn't be worlds apart, but I guess at its core has some pretty key consistent ideas. Now, before I kind of want to reflect a bit on the why of the jacket, and I'm almost at my end, so I really appreciate everybody's attention. I want to show you this beautiful image of Marlon Brando, which actually, if anyone's interested, is on page 105 of this exhibition book that GOMA is selling at the moment. It's absolutely beautiful book full of great motorbike images and this lovely film still from The Wild One from 1953. So I want to quote from theorist Marvin J. Taylor as I now reflect on why the leather jacket held such power. And you can gaze over Marlon Brando's face as I do this. So he is not exactly the hyper-masculine creation of Tom of Finland, but he is not a company man. He is a rebel, not exactly without a cause, but who is deeply suspicious of causes, untrusting of systems, angry, but not immediately violent. His signature is the black leather jacket, which hides his vulnerability and provides him with a protective second skin. He has rejected authority, but also has rejected the middle and upper class kids who became hippies because they could afford to reject authority. He is more urban, more working class. He takes on the black leather jacket as a protest and as protection. So what I like about the statement, as Taylor describes here, the jacket is quite a multifaceted play on norms as a symbol. It also plays on boundaries and meanings, especially as its history emerges through the 20th century. In its physical form, the jacket plays on binaries as well. So the contrast of this rich pigmented leather that is soft in texture like animal skin against the hard, shiny metallic geometry of zips and metalware on jackets, that's a really interesting binary that visually is quite striking. Another binary it kind of embodies is, the soft organic nature of leather compared to the rigid geometric tailoring that the jacket is forced into. We take this very linear organic object and make it into this geometric structure. It's also interesting, I guess, the contrast of messaging around the jacket's practicality and protection and usefulness compared to what is like a really sensual experience wearing a leather jacket. I've always found that really interesting, that slipping one on, very few people can help but go, ooh. So I think that's a wonderful contradiction of the jacket. I think lots of these contradictions also play out aesthetically too. So the jacket is this polished, incredibly structured, seemingly immovable object, which contrasts really greatly with the fragile body of the wearer. Where this jacket will be forever smooth and beautiful, the wearer's body will slowly wrinkle and decompose. And I love that kind of permanence and impermanence and that play that we see in the jacket. Adding to these kind of, symbolic contrasts and these physical contrasts that we all embody within this one object is the fact that the jacket just looks good. Like, we're trained in talking about leather jackets being masculine, but they look really good on humans generally. The really sharp lines that are cast by a jacket, not always angular, but are sharp and defined, really embolden and accentuate the human form. They make the human body a really solidly rich shape with very pleasing angles. And I think regardless of the gender of the wearer, they convey a sense of strength and sleekness always. I argue that it is these immutable aesthetic qualities of the leather jacket, no matter how it is reimagined or restyled, that makes them endlessly popular. Pair this with the capacity to carry as an anti-establishment message for so many people, from bikers to punks to queer communities. And interesting on this spectrum, I guess, of morals and ethics is from skinheads through to Black Panthers. The adoption of the black leather jacket, in a way, symbolizes what unites these causes. It is a dissatisfaction with the status quo and the structures that instill it. Whether those structures are heteronormativity, so gender and sexuality, or race or class, the leather jacket has been used as a political vehicle in all of these agendas. So I hope after today, you wear your leather jacket with maybe a bit more flamboyance and intention, knowing that many great social revolutionaries have done so before you.